Sorry. The doorbell that makes a big noise in the recording. Looking to see because around yesterday.
Can I just make a point that if you do this, like that up here, I don't think you can get the noise from outside. That's fine.
There's no one around yesterday or the day before. I could really hear it going.
Yeah, well, the people who came in and came out were not as aware of someone.
You got builders on the side here. They can fix your door for you.
Sure. Okay. Anyway, we'll discuss it afterwards.
You're the bossing builders over here to move the door. No.
All right.
Good?
Yeah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehakol yeh b'dvarai. Okay, good morning to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this Erev Shabbos Kodesh. A brand new day and a brand new Torah, beginning Torah Chof Test, the 29th lesson in Likutei Moharan. And today's class is dedicated by Aaron and Shoshana Blackman for the Aliyah's Neshama of Michal Ben Yisrael. His yahrzeit was yesterday. His Neshama should have an Aliyah, also sponsored anonymously, and zechus Yitzchak Gedalyah Ben Ilanit and Ilanit bat Miriam, as well as by Yossi Meyer, zechus for Yosef Ben Rivka and family. Also sponsored by R Klein, Ilanit, his parents, Rivka Bryndel bas Simcha, and Ya'akov ben Yisha'yahu. The Neshamas should have an Aliyah, and our learning should be a zechus for all the names that were mentioned, b'siyata d'shmaya. So let's jump in. Torah Chof Test, Hai Gavra. We go back to the Torahs of the Sabbath Be'atuna, and we learn about Hai Gavra, about a person, right? Well, this was the question being asked of Rabbi Shu ben Hanania by the Sabbath Be'atuna, and they said, Hai Gavra, this person, the Azel Boi Itza. He goes and he wants to marry a particular woman, but they wouldn't give this woman to him to marry. The family didn't agree. So my chazi da azal lehecha dimid lemine. So what kind of calculation would it be for him to then go to a family which is higher pedigree, more miyuchas than the family that he initially went to, and they turned him down because he wasn't on the level to marry into that family? What kind of cheshbon is that he would go to a family with a higher level, right, of pedigree? Why would he do that? So Rabbi Shu ben Hanania shkal siksa, he took a peg, and datzal asata, and he tried to stick it in on the lower half of a wall, and it wouldn't go in. Dali, and then he lifted the peg, datzal eila, and he tried to push it into a higher part of the wall, and it went in. Amar, and he said, Hai nami misrami ulei bas mazle. It must be that the initial family, it wasn't about pedigree per se. On a this worldly level, it looked like that was the reason, but it just wasn't his shidduch. It wasn't the bas mazle. And so, this worldly conditions, notwithstanding, he went to a different family because min shemayim, that was his shidduch, that was his mazel. That's the Gemara that we're learning. Let's just see the Rashi here. The midla minei shem yucheses merishaina. He went to a family that was more miyuchas, that had a higher and purer level of pedigree than the first family. So they asked Rabbi Shimon Hanania, right? The guy doesn't learn. He went to this family and it didn't work out. So why would he go to a family that ostensibly on the surface level should be more challenging than the first? Kol shekain. Siksa Kabila, right? He took a peg, datsa, hishpil yada b'makam she'ein charba kaisel. He tried to stick it into a place where there was no hole in the wall. All it didn't go in. But then dale datsa, he lifted his hand, nekev, and over there was a little hole, there was a little crack, right, in the wall. And when he tried to stick the peg in, it went in because there was a place for the peg to go in. And with that, he answered the question using a practical exhibit and to demonstrate what he meant to say. Okay, and we're going to come back to that at the end of this very beautiful and glorious and deep and important lesson. So it says they had the Gerebes Chus Yagan Alina Ba'al Kol Yisrael Amen Va'amen. Ois Aleph. Says the Tzaddik, Loi Kol Dibur Nikr Dibur. Not all speech is actually called speech. Ki Dibur She'in Nishma Min Iskabel In Nikr Dibur. Speech that is spoken but not received, makes no impact, is not actually called Dibur. Because dibur is communication more than it is the speaking of words. And communication requires the person who's being communicated to be communicated to, right? That there needs to be some kind of actual delivery of the message in order for the communication to be communication. Otherwise, if a person speaks, but it doesn't go to anyone on the other side, it's not nikra dibur. Dibur means relational interaction.
His partner. The source of dibur went from my Morris.
Beautiful, beautiful. Nahon. Ein a nikra dibur. It isn't just a declaration, exactly, right? It's relationship oriented. Beautiful. Bechinas, the aspect of the pasuk in Tehillim, ein oimer ve'ein devarim. So over here would be sort of it hints that it's not just dibur, it's also mimer. Okay, but ein oimer ve'ein devarim b'li nishma kailam. Right? It's not. So what does the literal pasuk mean? It's talking about the days exchange information, the nights speak, right? But they speak without a voice being heard, right? But they don't speak with words. So the Rebbe takes that pasuk, he abstracts it, and he says that it teaches us an important lesson about what speech is or isn't. And the Rebbe says, if a person's words b'li nishma kailam are not heard, then ein omer ve'ein devarim, right? It's a remez, right? You see here that it cannot be considered words or speech if b'li nishma kailam, if the words that are being spoken are not actually being integrated and accepted. The ikar mashen eskabel dibur. So how does a person get speech to be accepted? We actually had a pasuk, he doesn't bring the pasuk here, but it was one of the first pasukim that we have encountered in the sefer Likutei Moharan. There's a good trivia question, which spoke about, without looking, which spoke about speech being accepted, right? Do you remember what pasuk that was? We had a pasuk, huh?
Chen.
Yes, chen. It had to do with chen. Divrei chachamim benachas nishmaim. Right, the words of Chachamim are received in nachas. So says the Rebbe, the ikar mashen is kabbalah dibur, the primary capacity and ability that words have to be heard, to be received, are only if they're words of goodness and sweetness. Everybody wants to hear good things. Everybody wants to feel good. Everybody wants to hear words that are addressing the goodness inside of them. And therefore, when a person's speech is speech that tends toward goodness, that tends toward sweetness, and this is a perfect follow through from Chavches, when it's Torah from the Alfin, right, where it's not hidden and concealed, but we speak about HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence and everything, and at all times, and give people chizuk and give people strength. Then the words are accepted. Everybody always wants to know, what did the Baal Shem Tov do that started this populist movement, that swept the whole Eastern Europe? The Ramchal was also a great tzaddik, could talk great things. He didn't start a mass movement. R Yaakov didn't have a mass movement. He had what was called Gurei Ari. He had a couple of lion cubs around him, a couple of students, in Svas, but he didn't change Klal Yisrael like the Baal Shem Tov did. It's arguable that nobody changed Klal Yisrael in that way, on that level of like waves of transformation that happened so rapidly in 2 generations. Lo shamanu, like we haven't heard such a thing, right? There were other tzaddikim that had a major impact, but on a cultural, social, popular level, it's hard to think of a number, of other tzaddikim who accomplished that. And the answer that the Rabbi Nachman is giving us here is because he was called the Baal Shem Tov. Because there were a lot of Baal Shem, there were a lot of Kabbalists, there were a lot of Mekubalim, but he was the Baal Shem Tov. He was the Baal Shem whose whole message was good, was Tov. And people want to hear that because it gives people strength. It gives people what they need. As I adibur nishma min eskabel. So then when there's Tov ba'adibur, when it's the words of the Baal Shem Tov, as I adibur nishma min eskabel, then everybody's impacted by it, or at least many people are impacted by it. Al kishein tov ba'adibur, but when the words lack this element of Tov, eino niskabel, then the words are not really heard. The words are spoken, but they're never received on the other side. The message is sent, but on WhatsApp it says waiting for this message to be received, right? It doesn't go through. So how do you do that? How does a person make sure that their words are communicating goodness and fortifying in the mind of the one who's listening to the words a consciousness that tends toward good, that wants to see good, that wants to experience Hashem's presence? This is by virtue of a person who speaks words that are taken from the place of das, of consciousness. And in Likutei Moharan, das always means emunah. Right? Das is the consciousness of Yaakov Avinu. Das is the consciousness of connection. Va'adam yada eschave ishto, right? It's the coming together of our reality and the reality beyond, of the spiritual realm. When you speak the message of what we'll just go back to, the 4 Alephs. Azai yesh bo tov. Then the words are saturated with goodness. Aval kishadibur b'lo das. When a person speaks words that are not coming from that place, azai ein bo tov. So then the words are vacant, are void of goodness. They're not able to carry the positive message. They're not able to look at the positive side. And there's so much positive always. There's so much positive always, A person really chooses what they want to see in this world because there's always something bad to focus on. But I think it's usually true that the quantity of bad that there is to focus on, while qualitatively more irksome, like Yomar Baba Metzia says, something Pei Gimel, right? This, an empty jar, kish karyale, right? It makes a very loud noise, because there are just a few coins in it, and so it makes a much louder noise. So qualitatively, it might be like, and like I spoke yesterday, we are sort of wired to want to smooth out the last creases, of reality before Mashiach comes. And so we are hyper-focused on those points. But in quantity, there's so much more good than there is not good. So much more. Right? Without getting into the politics of it at all on any level, it's not our place. So, we're not from there. We're not in that culture. We're not, person can have opinions that, should really try to keep it to themselves unless they have a, skin in the game from the standpoint of, living in that culture and in that kushya of, learning and the army and, all these things, not for me to get into at all. But how many, what percentage of that gathering was running after that reporter throwing water bottles, right? I'm sure everybody saw that clip, or if you didn't, ashreichem. So what percentage was, did that happen? Yeah, it happened, right? Are the middos horrible? Yeah. Were they all young people? Yeah. Were there adults 2 or 3 times in the video who tried to step in and say, what are you doing? Also, yeah, right? But there was 600,000 people there. Again, I'm not getting into, was it right? Was it the right timing? What, it's just, I'm sure everybody has very strong opinions. I'm not getting into that now. I'm just talking about, I'm using that as a muscle in terms of what do we choose to focus on, right? In terms of behavior, in terms of values. It's crazy. We'll jump to the 20 troublemakers, and the 40 people who climbed up a building and, stood on a crane like idiots, and we say, oh, the whole thing. It's, again, we choose to see what we want to see. And there can be many, many things that are true at once. You can disagree or feel an aversion toward the whole inyan of what was going on, and you might feel that there's a better way of going about it, or that maybe we should march in gratitude to the soldiers, or maybe we should also march in just for something good, and that could all be true. But our mabat, our perspective, needs to be sort of looking to try to find the good. That's das. Right? And I think sometimes we're afraid to do that because we think that if we focus on the good, so that automatically means that you're basically putting your stamp of approval on every element of everything. And that's not true. Life is complicated. People are complicated. Issues are complicated, but there is good. And to focus on the good and to be like, the Berditcher we were learning for the Kedushas Levi last night, right? And to try to focus on that is a big, big, big avodah. It's a big avodah. But right? right? When a person's the whole time is below das, is without recognition of hashgacha and emunah, and Hashem running the show, and Hashem really being, a manhig the world as I in by toiv. So then it's going to lack toiv bebechinas gam below das nefesh loy toiv. Without das, nefesh loy toiv. So then a soul is missing toiv, because das is toiv. Awareness of Hashem's presence, awareness of our essential connectivity to the divine, that's toiv. And nefesh hu adibur. And nefesh, it isn't just linking loy das to loy toiv, right? He's saying something more specific because we make reference in this pasuk to nefesh. And what is nefesh? Nefesh is dibur. The human being was created to be a living spirit, and the Targum Onkelos tells us leruach mimalala, a speaking spirit. And so nefesh is the vessel for the ruach that is a speaking ruach. And therefore, gam beloy das, if a person is living without the consciousness of emunah, then nefesh, which is dibur, nefesh chai, ruach mamalala, loy toiv. It will not have toiv and will not be able to be accepted. Now you might ask, but quantitatively speaking, adarabba, it would look, even though I mentioned before that I think there's much more good than bad, and there are small pockets, which just are much, much, much louder. But it seems that there are a lot of people that are impacted by words, right, that are not carrying the message of toiv, that are not carrying the message of love and of looking at the good side and inclusivity, etc. Right? And so you'd have to say that it's just either it's just on the surface, or it's just in the broad scheme of things, it's just temporary. But it's not real. It isn't real, and it might last a generation or two. We're already seeing, I should point out, a shift in hashkafa in Eretz Yisrael in the younger generation, who are shifting, and I had this conversation with many, many people recently, and they see it. People who are involved in demographics, people involved in real estate, people involved in, seeing where people go and what the different community makeup looks like in various places. It is tending toward openness. It is tending toward more. The next generation is not as militant. It's as the previous generation. Things are heading, Be'ezras Hashem, things are heading toward reconciliation. Obviously, there are a lot of strong feelings, etc. But it is just Ra is temporary. Things are always moving toward the toiv. And so, if it's temporary, so then, it can look like dibur that isn't transmitting or communicating a message of das, has an impact, but ultimately it's not real, and it doesn't point the way toward the future. It's constantly getting less and less and less, as opposed to getting more and more and more.
Can you just explain a bit more the point of nefesh? Because I'm just confused. What is nefesh here?
Yeah, nefesh is in the pasuk about HaKadosh Baruch Hu creating the human being. Hashem blew, right, the spirit into Adam Rishon's nostrils, and the pasuk says Adam became a living spirit, and the Targum Onkelos says on nefesh chaya ruach memalala, a speaking spirit. So what Rabbi Nachman is saying is that because we see in this context that nefesh is related to ruach memalala, so then in the pasuk gam b'loy das nefesh loy toiv, so nefesh there is a reference to speech. Right, so beloy das nefesh, speech. Now, loy toiv, right, will not carry a goodly message. Okay, ois beis. So what do we do? What should we do about this? How do we make sure that our diburim are full of goodness, so that people want to hear? Ulahakim ularaimim es hadas hu aidei shavachat tzaddikim. To elevate our thinking, to elevate our consciousness, is through praising the tzaddikim. When we venerate and we respect and we look toward, from the standpoint of guidance and modeling what a person could become in this world, and we genuinely feel love toward the tzaddikim, through this, our level of awareness arises, because as people, our value system is modeled after the kind of people that we want to emulate, the kind of people that we look toward as guides, right? That's usually a good indicator as to where a person is and what a person's values are, because each person is inadequate in and of themselves. We're always looking toward people who we perceive to be further along the road, and the question is what road, right? But sometimes it's hard to see where you are. The question is, you have to look like at the people who are positioned further along the road, and then it gets a little bit clearer as to who I emulate and who I want to be like and how I want to live my life. And even though right now I might look pariv, looking down the road can make things a little bit sharper and clearer because the roads diverge, right? What is it? Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, that poem. The road less traveled, no? Anyway, so famous poem. So right, but they diverge. So as the paths are just setting out, the distance between them is not so clear. But if you look at people who are positioned much, much, much further down the respective road, you can see, but if you could, what would you be? Right? Without circumstances preventing you for one reason or another, right? Like, because now everybody lives a power of lifestyle. If you can flick a switch, right? Really, and that's like who really are you, in a sense, right? The people that we emulate are the people that we really, really are. And the only reason that we're not them is because there are obstacles, challenges, things that are getting in the way. But what would we be if we could be? So it's a big deal, right? Like, who do we emulate? And the Rebbe says, the more that we adjust the emulation or the more that we adjust who it is that we emulate toward a higher spiritual frequency, so that we're constantly praising the Tzaddikim and speaking about people who are totally given over and devoted to Hashem and their middos and the way that they interacted with people and their thoughts and their philosophies and the way that they felt and lived. So then your mind gets elevated. There's no question about that. Your mind gets elevated because you're emulating great people. The truth is, to be totally honest with you, I would not be sitting here today doing this with my life if it hadn't become clear to me at like 18, 19 years old that I wanted to be like Reb Shlomo Carlebach. It was just, I wanted to do what he did, right? Notwithstanding whatever, right? Again, Ayin Tova, right? On the overwhelming majority of godless that the person overflowed with, right? To me, he was a great man. He was a great man. He went around the world giving people chizuk. He went around the world giving people, strength and emunah. And he brought such beautiful music to the world. And he was just full of love and full of, strength and clarity. And that's what I wanted to be like. I'm a far cry from that. But I still look toward that. But that changed my life because all of a sudden here was a person that I could aspire, like a real, not just an abstract idea. Here was a person who in my sense didn't just like teach Hasidus, but walked the walk, right? He was mamish kipshutai, chesed overflowing. Like he gave all of his money away, right? He made money at a concert, walked out, gave it to the first person. Like he really lived it. Jews, non-Jews, just no matter what, he was, to me, he was a Yid, like saturated with Yiddishkeit in every tiny fiber of his being. He was also human. He was also doing tshuva all the time. He was also getting better all the time. He was also, that was actually his definition of a Yid is someone who wants to be better tomorrow, right? And that's what he was. And that's why he's so relatable also, because I have struggles and he had struggles, and so that's a huge sugya of Shlomo, and it's not for now, but to me, that's godless. That's real godless. Courage, individuality, doing what he knew was right against all odds, not caring what people thought about him, doing what needed to be done, rolling up his sleeves, putting his money where his mouth is, like all of that stuff. And that's why I'm here, is because I'm following that road. Because I'm trying to follow that road, and that's why I'm blessed to be able to do what I do every day. Because of that. It should be a continued zechus for him, and because everything, every tiny little, whatever I'm able to do that's maybe somewhat a little bit good is directly charged to his account. Make no mistake about that. Directly. Al Yedei Zen Esreim Hadas. So that can elevate a person's consciousness. Bebechinas, and the Rebbe always brings sources, but Bechinas, the pasuk in the Varim says, Kinesher Yatir Kinai, like an eagle awakens its nest. Nishra, says the Zohar Kadosh, Darucha. The word Nesher, we had this actually in a previous Torah. Nishra, the eagle, is a reference to the Ruach, and Da Bechinas Tzaddik. And Ruach is an aspect of the Tzaddik, Bebechinas, Ish Asher Ruach Boy. So Kanesher, so Nesher is Ruach, Yair Kinoi, Shehu Ma'ir HaMoichim Etardimusan. When a person praises the Tzaddik Kinesher, and the person wants to be, what's the word Kinesher? So Nesher is just a reference to the Tzaddik. How does the Rebbe know over here that it's praising the Tzaddik? And what does it mean to praise a Tzaddik? So I explained that it's emulating, right? And praise is just an indicator as to this, that we emulate those who we praise. But the Rebbe learns it out from the letter Chof. Kinesher Yair Kinoi. Kinesher is praising the tzaddik, meaning I want to be like Kinesher. Chof hadimyon. I want to try to be medame myself to the vision of what the tzaddik is. Kinesher, so then Yair Kinoi. That will awaken Kinoi. Says the Rebbe, Kinoi is a reference to the mind. It wakes the mind up because it says, I could be great because he was great, she was great. I want to be like that. And it wakes the mind up from its slumber, from the aspect of a constricted mindset. It's like Kol Nidre, right? Why do we begin Yom Kippur with Kol Nidre? The Svarim say, because Yom Kippur is a day of such godless and such greatness and such, at least ideally, extraordinary striving and yearning and dreaming and envisioning of what we could be if we were free from the burden of sin. That we need to begin Yom Kippur by renouncing all of our vows. What vows? So the Svarim say it's talking about the vows that you make about yourself. It's the self-limiting beliefs. It's the feelings like, oh, but this I can never do. I struggle with this and I'll never not struggle with this. That's a vow. You come into Yom Kippur, Kol Nidre, you wipe everything away. You renounce all of those statements. And then you enter into Yom Kippur. So the mind is stuck in Moichin Dekatnos. How do we get the mind out of Moichin Dekatnos? Look at the lives of people who broke free. That's how. Because that's unimpeachable. Somebody says, no, you'll make it in the end. Okay, it's words in the luft, it's just sweet. But it's just floating around in the air. It's not. But if you can point to a person who was in your situation and actually got out, then if someone can do it, everyone can do it, and you can do it too. That's what it is. That's really what it is. So Kinesher, when a person is able to look at a model of someone who was there and made it, and like Rabbi Nachman said, how much he struggled and he suffered and he failed and he had to try millions of times. He said 1,000 times in one day that the Rebbe would have to start again. He knew it. The darkness and the pain and the suffering and the confusion and the feeling that Hashem is totally hidden from this place, the void. What Rabbi Nachman describes, and we'll learn this in Torah Samachay, a very famous teaching, the Chalal HaPanoi. He knew the abyss, he knew the void, and yet he paved the way. And he was very explicit about all of his challenges for exactly this reason. Because the Rebbe said, don't think that I got this from Shemayim as a gift. I got this because I did the work. And the Rebbe said this again and again and again. Throughout the whole Sichos you find this idea. This is a very important sentiment. The Rebbe said, follow my path, meaning the way, step in my footprints, and you will become, what he says, a tzaddik kamayni mamish. You will be exactly like me. You will be able to access the levels that I reached. It's just work. But if a person doesn't have the model of someone who was where we are and made it out, and then we think that all tzaddikim are tzaddikim because they were born with great souls and because they just had a gift finish, so then we'll stay stuck in what we think that we're stuck in. But kinesher, when you're able to point toward the great eagle, which is an aspect of the tzaddik, and you say, Kinesher, I would love to be that way one day. I want to emulate that. So then Ya'ir Kinai, that wakens up the brain. Why is Kinai the brain, the mind? Why does that free us from our self-limiting beliefs? Ya'ir Kinai. Says that Tzaddik Shuhu Ma'ir HaMoichin Mitar Dimusam, right? It wakens the brain up from the slumber. Go to the next line. Kinai is a reference to Knei Chachma, Knei Bina. Kinai is an aspect of the word liknot, right? To acquire. And there's a pasuk in Mishlei that puts the word acquire in the context of Chachma and Bina, the two cognitive powers, right? Knei Chachma, Knei Bina, Shehem HaMoichin, which is the mind. And the Rebbe says, "Afilu malachim," even the angels, when they want to communicate a message that can be heard among themselves in whatever way that angels communicate. In an aspect of the pasuk, they create words lishmoya b'kol devarai, for their words to be heard, and this is a reference to the malachim. They first praise HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Shehu Tzaddiko Shel Olam, who is the ultimate tzaddik of all tzaddikim, Mahu Afata, that we're supposed to look toward HaKadosh Baruch Hu and try to emulate him. He is the ultimate tzaddik. The tzaddikim are tzaddikim because they excelled at emulating Hashem, but Hashem is the tzaddik. Tzaddik Hashem b'chol drachav. Shehu Tzaddiko Shel Olam. B'chinas tzaddik Hashem b'chol drachav. V'al yidei zeh nasa hadibur. And then the angels' speech becomes speech because their mind is opened up. Again, on whatever level we can't really understand malachim, right? But on whatever level their mind, their neural network, their neural net, if you will, is illuminated by an influx of data from the tzaddik shel olam. And that's why that pasuk that ends with oisei devarai lishmoya b'kol devarai, they create words that they intend to be heard, begin with the words v'zeh baruch hu Hashem malacha. The angels praise Hashem. They bless Hashem. And then the pasuk continues, oisei devarai lishmoya b'kol devarai. Then the only way to get to a point of being able to speak words that are nitkabel is by first praising the tzaddik, by first emulating the tzaddik. So we emulate tzaddikim. Angels on the higher plane of existence emulate Hashem. Right? They emulate the source. So for us, Hashem is very abstract. Hashem gave us tzaddikim who model for us the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the world, like the Zohar Kodesh says, Shalish pa'amah mashana yirah kol zechorcha es p'nei adon Hashem, right? That 3 times a year we come to the Beis HaMikdash, Shalosh Regalim, and we receive Es P'nei Adon Hashem. The S is a hard word to translate, right? The face, the presence of Hashem. And the Zohar says, we know that the word Es is always a riboy, right? It was a Shimon HaMsuni, right? It was darshaning all of the Es in Shabbat Torah until he came to Es Hashem Lekachatira, right? And he abstained because what else can we include in the fear of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Until Rabbi Akiva came along, and Rabbi Akiva said, "Es is l'rabbis talmidei chachamim," right? It comes to include respect and awe of Torah scholars, right? And he put that on the same level somehow in the context of Hashem b'chvod v'atzmai. And the Zohar takes this, pasuk, which is much more radical in context, Es P'nei Adon Hashem, the face of God, right? Not just what you should fear, inclusive of, This is like the. And the Zohar says, no big deal. Darajbi. This word es is coming to include Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Like, he es P'nei Adon Hashem is Rabbi Shimon, which is the prototype for all tzaddikim of that nature who are reflective of the presence of Hashem in the world. So we venerate the tzaddikim. And Hashem wants that. Hashem created the world in such a way where there's a thing called the tzaddik. And we look toward the tzaddik to emulate, to become like the tzaddik. The malachim are emulating HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So Baruch Hu Hashem malacha. The malachim are praising Hashem, emulating, so to speak, on whatever level an angel could emulate and strive and move and change. And that's why this is very complicated, right? Because it's not the same as us, obviously. But then, then they produce words that are heard. Yeah.
Just about the malachim. So we strive for the removal of the ego. That's the masach. But is there such a thing for the malach?
I just mentioned it's complicated, and we're going to leave that aside for now. Obviously, it's not exactly the same. The Rebbe is finding a similar model among a pasuk that relates to tzaddikim to show that there's this similar trajectory. But obviously, it's not going to be the same thing as human beings who are mahalchim, right? Who are able to walk, and malachim can't walk. Okay, so that's that. Let's take a look at Eis Gimel Be'ezras Hashem, and the tzaddik says like this. So what's this whole thing about, right? Because we're talking about consciousness. We're talking about who we are. We're talking about what it means to be human. We're talking about what it means to be a Jew. We're talking about our identity, which is a really deep thing. So it really relates to such a deep part of ourselves. How do we want to be in this world? What do we want to be? What do I want to make of my life? So the Rebbe says, "V'zeh b'chinas begadim levanim." This is the aspect of white clothing. Begadim levanim. Gemara Kedushin makes reference to, I mentioned this, I'm making a scene of Be'ezras Hashem Sunday evening at the Tzedakah Tzaddik Shir. So if any of the Chaver locally don't usually come or able to come, first of all, you should try to usually come if you can. But if we're able to make sure that we have a minyan for a siyum, it's my grandfather's yahrzeit, and Min HaShamayim might happen to be finishing Kedushin on Sunday. So this Sunday evening, okay, 8 o'clock, it's going to be upstairs. And Be'ezras Hashem, the Gemara Kedushin has a whole paragraph speaking about the different demographics within society, and the Chachamim were likening different components of society to different things, and it wasn't just speaking about the spiritual levels; it was speaking about the way that they dress. And when they reflected on the Chachamim, they said "Elam kimalachi shacharis," which seems to refer, the Mefarshim said that they used to wear begadim levanim. They used to wear white clothing. Rabbi Nachman himself, at a certain point in his life, started to wear all white on Shabbos. They wore all white. In Yavniel, which is a Breslover community that was led by Rav Shik, Zatzal, they all wear white. They wear white bekashas on Shabbos. I don't know if they wear white shreimlach. They may. I don't know. But they wear all white. And it was the minhag Mikubalim. Mikubalim would wear white clothing. There's an inyan of begadim levanim, right? White clothing. So says the Rebbe, somehow it's like, what's the kesher, but we're going to unfold it. The Rebbe says, Hainu tikkun hadibur. White clothing is the tikkun hadibur, is the rectification for speech. Shehu bechinas malchus peh, which is the aspect of malchus peh. It's the spiritual level of malchus, the sphera of malchus, which we know is associated with speech. Hu bechinas begadim levanim. This is the aspect of white clothing. Just speaking demographically, going back to what I mentioned earlier about Israel and the separations and the different communities and the different, it's not impossible to say that the Charedim, are generally an embodiment of the midah of Gevura, right? The very word Charedi, right, connotes trembling Gevura. They hold the line, there's a certain rigidity and a strictness, and it's necessary. It's beautiful. It's one of the components of Am Yisrael. And then, the sort of like Dati Lumi, or that more Chardal, like that, not Chardal really, but more, the Hesder yeshivas and that approach is much more chesed oriented, right? Much more chesed oriented. First of all, their connection to Chasidus is immense, right? They're drawing on Rav Kook. Rav Kook was mamish, and even though he was a Litvak, but he was communicating in the deepest way the teachings of Chasidus. And in their worldview, they're much more patuach. They're much more patuach. They're much more open. And you see this Indian in the clothing, right? Like if it was a 1,000,000-man march, from that demographic, it would have been a huge crowd of white, or not. If not white, then beige, right? But lighter, because they wear khaki pants and they wear, and their shirts. They don't wear jackets, and their tzitzis are flying in the payas and the white kippahs. Like it's so fascinating on a communal, unconscious level. The clothing tends toward chesed. And on the Haredi, communal unconscious level, it's black, right? It's an interesting thing. So clothing is very deep. Clothing is reflective of the pnimius. Panim and panim. What you see on the surface is often reflective of what's going on inside. And this is the deep, 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 deep depth of Seif Maseh, Malchus, is b'machshava tchila, is reflective of the initial thought, which is the most pnimi. Because when a person wants to go ahead and build a building, which Rabbi Nachman will speak about, we're going to have that mashal in Likutei Moharan. I don't think we've had it yet. The British Rav brings the mashal, others. The first thing that they do is they envision, even before they draw up a blueprint, the first thing they do is they have a mental image of what they would like to build, right? That's called a ratzon. And that's the most panini, because on the level of the Olam HaGashmi, nothing happened yet. Nothing. They didn't go through any process of gathering materials, drawing up plans, actually building things. That's called the machshava tchila. And then the Seif Maseh, which from the standpoint of spheres, right? You have Keser, the first sphera, correlates to machshava tchila, which is ratzon. So then the last sphera, Seif Maseh, is Malchus. Is only the externalization and the manifestation of what previously existed in the initial thought. So in some strange way, the element that's furthest away from the first is actually the most reflective of the first. Because it turns out that all of the other 8 spheres were just steps in between, but it wasn't really about them, because really all there is Keser and Malchus. Everything else is just sort of steps to be able to bring what was in Keser out into Malchus. But really all there is just, I'm doing this because Keser and Malchus, but it's really this. Right? Keser Melucha. They're absolutely bound up one to the other. That's the side Ashes Chayil. Ashes is the feminine aspect. Principle is always Malchus. Is itself Ateres Bala. Is itself the crown Keser. Ashes Chayil is Ateres Bala, which is extremely, extremely deep. Bidyuk, exactly. That's why you see the Aleph at the end. The Aleph and the Yud from yesterday. Exactly. Right? The Aleph being Keser and the Yud at the end being Malchus, but it's Keser. You find the Aleph there, right? So the Rebbe says that white clothing is an aspect of Malchus Peh. Shubechinas begadim levanim, that's the aspect of white, which is the most external, is reflective of what's going on inside. So the Rebbe says, Kitzarach lishmar ma'oid es habegadim. Person has to be very careful with their clothing. Shlo yivaz es habegadim. Not to denigrate the clothing. Begadim are very, very important. Rak l'shamran karoi. To guard them properly. Shlo yavay aleim shum kesem uravav. There should be no stain on our clothing. And any person that is a greater person, closer to Hashem, has to be all the more immaculate with their clothing. All the more immaculate. Sometimes, it's like the holier somebody is, the dustier their hat is. It has to be the opposite. It has to be the absolute opposite. We need to bring back the principle of aesthetic into our communities. Man Malchi Rabbanan, right? That the Rabbanan are supposed to be kings. They have to carry themselves with a sense of dignity. Dignity. Hasidim did this, right? The Rebbes were kings, And the Rebbes actually used to be kingly, So one gets the feeling that now it's not like it used to be, but it used to be. The Rishon was Mamash a king. Mamash a king. The inyan of begadim was very, very important, because dira betachtoin means it's not just enough. It goes right back to what we were saying yesterday, that there's elokus somewhere in the shemayim above. It means the olam ha'asiyah, the physical world, our experience of reality needs to be reflective of that principle. Where the alephs, so to speak, just going back to Chof because it's such a natural, it's the mamish, this is an easy one that flows right into it. Right, because we're talking about Tzaddikim and that worldview and Dibur that's filled with Toiv and godliness. So it's just Aleph, 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 Aleph. And so, like we pointed out, that Rafi pointed out, the last layer is just Aleph. That's called Begadim Levanim. So V'chol Mishu Gadol Yoser Tzarich Lishmar, so Begadim Yoser has to be very careful. Because anybody who's greater is going to be scrutinized. It says the Gemara in Shabbos that a Talmud Chacham who there's a stain on their clothing, chayiv misa. Such a thing. Chayiv misa, right? So it's not actually, it's not like chayiv misa. We're not going to kill a Talmud Chacham, who has a grape juice stain on his Shabbos shirt. That's not what we're talking about. But it's a turn of phrase, right, to express the severity, the surprising severity, if you will, of how important it is to maintain whiteness on the level of asiya, on the level of manifestation in the physical world. Because the clothing themselves will be done him. Interesting thing. Because Malchus is a place that's fraught with severity. Malchus is din. Malchus is the most constricted of realms. Malchus is the place here where godliness is, at least on the surface, least perceptible. It's the most mitzumtzam. And it relates to Dibur because the Zohar Kadosh says Malchus peh. Malchus is associated with the capacity to speak. And Malchus is the physical world, the world that we live in, the world of Asiya. And the world was created with speech. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't speak because HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't have a mouth. So obviously it's a concept. And we have to abstract HaKadosh Baruch Hu's speech from our speech to be able to focus on what it means to speak and then to say that Hashem did that, but in a spiritual sense. And what is speech? Is to take voice, we've spoken about this in the past, that is infinite in a certain sense, right? Because a measure of voice can be made into every word in every language, and then to constrict it into a number of particular letters that form a particular word in a particular language. That's called tzimtzum. So the voice is infinite. That's the Bechin of Yaakov Avinu, or the Mid of Tiferes, or Kudsha Barichu. That's how Kol Yaakov. Yaakov Avinu is associated with the principle of voice. That's Tiferes. That's Kudsha Barichu. And then Shchinte, the Shechina Malchus, is associated with Dibur. And that's David HaMelech. Ani Shalav V'chi Adaber Heimal HaMelech. David is all about Dibur. Ani Tefillah. David is all about speech. So Malchus is associated with Begadim. Right? Malchus is the aspect of Beged, as we're going to see in a minute. But we've explained. And Malchus is connected to speech. And Malchus is constricted. There's din in Malchus. There's called Dina de Malchusa Dina. The name of Malchus is, who knows? What's the spiritual name that relates to the sphere, that Hashem's presence in the sphere, through the sphere of Malchus? Stuff has to be clear, mamish, on your fingertips. Mamish, you have to absolutely get this super clear. Basics. What's the shame of Malchus? The shame Adni. Aleph Daled Nun Yud. Aleph Daled Nun Yud. Right? Because all the spheres have shemas that are associated with them. It's going to be very hard to move in Pnimius Torah without fluency with the system. It's not hard. It just takes review. The shame of Malchus is Adni. So the SHIURIM say the most amazing thing. Flip around the words of Adni, and what word do you get? Dina. Dina de Malchusa Dina is a Talmudic principle. But it's not a Talmudic principle, it's a Kabbalistic principle. Because what the Gemara is telling you is that the shame of Malchus is Adni. Understand? Pshat and Sod are not two different realms that live in abstraction. They're one. The Gemara is Kabbalah, right? The Gemara, it is, Pshat is saturated with Sod. A person just has to develop the eyes to be able to see it. But Dina de Malchusa is Adni de Malchusa. But there's Din in Malchus. Because the begadim themselves, the clothing is the aspect of the sphere of Malchus. How do we know? The Gemara in Shabbos tells us that Rabbi Yochanan referred to his garments as mechabdusa. Please get me my mechabdusa. That's what he said. Not get me my coat. He said, get me my michabdusa. What is michabdusa? The thing that honors me, or the reflection of my kavod, because that's what a king is. The king's honor is reflected in the royal vestments and the garments of the king. Levush malchus, like we read in the Megillah. There's levush malchus. Malchus is associated with levush. And kavod, shezabechinas malchus, is the aspect of malchus bebechinas. The pasuk in Tehillim says, "Vayavai melech hakavod." Or he could have brought the other pasuk that we say 3 times a day, Baruch Shem Kivod Malchusai. Kavod and Malchus are always associated one with the other because kavod means glory. Meloi chala arts kivod. Kavod is presence. Malchus is presence. And so Rabbi Yochanan would refer to his garments as his Malchus. Because Malchus as a sphera is the outermost garment, kiviyachol, of the whole structure of existence. We're going from the Or Ein Sof and then Keser, right, is the first garment, and then Chachma, and then Bina, and then Chesed, and then Gevura and Tiferes, and Netzach, and Malchus, like what, the outermost layer, so to speak, that is preventing us from being able to access spirituality in even a little bit, or a lot of it, but even a little bit relatively of a more potent way. That final garment this is the reality we're living in. It's the garment of God, Malchus. And the Baal Tanya says, is there any difference between hugging a king when he's wearing his undershirt and hugging a king when he's bundled up in three sweaters and a winter coat, right? The king isn't, you're not hugging the coat, he's wearing a coat, you're hugging the king. The king is in the coat, right? So that's what this reality is. Hashem is in here. Hashem is, again, going back to what we learned earlier, Hashem is not somewhere up there, somewhere else. Hashem is literally here in this breath, in this chair, in this table, with our garments. And we're going to learn much more about them in Torah Lamed Gimel with our garments. And the final garment is the garment of Malchus. Dina de Malchusa Dina, Adni, Din. Rabbi Yochanan Karlam Ani Mechabduse, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchusai. Vehim Bechinas Tzedek Malchusa Kadisha. This is the aspect of what's referred to in the Zohar Kodesh. Tzedek is Malchusa Kadisha. The word Tzedek refers to Malchus. The word Tzadik refers to Yesod. And Tzedakah is the Shefa that flows from Yesod to Malchus. So Tzadik, Tzedakah, and Tzedek. But Tzedek is Malchusa Kadisha. And unsurprisingly, if Tzedek is related to Malchus, then what else might we think that Tzedek should be associated with? Garments. The Pasuk says in Eov, Tzedek lavashti. I enclothed myself in Tzedek. A person who denigrates Malchus, which means a person who denigrates the Olam Asiyah, which means a person who denigrates every aspect of the practicality of this worldliness by looking away from it and saying that godliness cannot be found there because of the Aleph and the Fulin, because thinking that somehow in the movement from Aleph to Beis and Beis to Gimel and Gimel to Dalet, the Aleph is not part of the equation anymore, because from that perspective we stop looking at this experience of reality as layers of an onion garments that enclose the king who's present within, and we think that we moved somewhere away from him. We moved Alf in Nefula. And that's called, says the Rebbe, Nimtza Shukim Moirid B'Malchus. That's called Moirid B'Malchus. That's called rebelling against the king. Because that's pushing godliness out of the tachtonim that he created to be invited into by virtue of our perspective of faith. And we pushed Hashem out of that realm. That's called Moirid B'Malchus. But Dina de Malchusa, Danoisai. So then there's Dina de Malchusa. And Dina de Malchusa is the same Adni, and Adni is the sphere of Malchus, and Malchus is covered, and covered is the garment. And therefore it's Tzaddik who has a stain on the garment is Chayiv Misa, because it's Mamish Moirid b'Malchus. And he means this on the most specific of ways. We'll end with this. He means this on the most practical of levels. A Talmud Chacham who does not respect his clothes meaning doesn't respect this world, doesn't respect showing up in a presentable way, is moirid b'malchus. He can believe in Hashem all he wants. That means that there's a fundamental lack of emunah from the standpoint of knowing that aesthetic matters, that the way you look matters, right? That the way a person carries themselves matters. That's also part of serving Hashem. That's called dir b'tachtayim. To the extent that a person who draws on the tradition of the Alpha Nefulin is moirid in that, that's moirid b'malchus. That's called finding a stain in their clothes. Chayiv misa kulei hai. Like, why? Because it's moirid b'malchus. Because the clothes are malchus. Because the clothes, in a quite literal sense and a conceptual spiritual sense, but on a literal sense, are reflective of the presence of Hashem in the lower world. So to be moirid in the clothing is to be moirid somehow in HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence in the lower realms of reality. Pili plaim. If you really think about it, it's pili plaim. I wish we had a little bit more time to go deeply into it, but we'll carry on Be'ezras Hashem on Monday morning, and we'll have the SD card, so the video will be better on YouTube to those who are going to be watching this. I'm wishing everybody the most wonderful lichtige Shabbos filled with the awareness and consciousness of the Tzaddikim Amitiyim. What Alfin to just see Hashem's presence in everything and to try to keep our clothes clean. Have a wonderful, wonderful Shabbos.
על כל נשימה שאני